Hi, my name's Emma Smith. I'm one of the English tutors here at Hertford, and on this short video we're going to talk to you about some of the questions that people have about studying English at Oxford and at Hertford. But first we'll introduce ourselves. So my specialist area is mostly Shakespeare and Renaissance literature, which means I mostly teach second and third years here at Hertford.
Hello everyone, my name is David Dwan. I'm a tutor at Hertford and I'm responsible largely for teaching in the areas of the 19th century and the 20th and early 21st century.
Hi, I'm Saida. I'm a second year English student and I'll be going to my final year in October.
So Saida has a few questions, I think, for us, and we'll also have a few questions for Saida. But do you want to ask us an opening question, Saida?
Yeah, I think what a lot of people want to know are what the key features of the Oxford syllabus are for English.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess one of the things that distinguishes Oxford's syllabus is it's quite historically based. It's extremely comprehensive in terms of the amount of literature and historical time, I suppose, it incorporates. And many of the papers seem to be constructed around literary periods. So if we take, say, first year, so when you come in, you'll essentially have about 4 papers to do in your first year. You've paper 1, which is a kind of core skills-led paper, and they're on theories of language and literary criticism, but the other 3 are period-based papers. So you would have one on early medieval literature from about 650 to 1350. You'd have 2 more then, much more modern papers. One, paper 3, which is literature in English from 1830 to 1910. And then in your second term, you do paper 4, which is literature in English from 1910 to the present day. I guess the thing to stress about these papers is that you're open to do almost anything within that range, which leads some people to say that there's, in fact, no syllabus as such in Oxford. Sometimes these historical parameters might seem quite defined and quite constraining. On other levels, you're basically open to do what you want within those temporal constraints. Emma, do you want to say something about year 2 and year 3?
Yeah, so you'd have exams on those four papers or 4 modules at the end of year 1, and then that's a sort of self-standing exam. It doesn't actually count towards your final degree classification. And in the second year, we pretty much fill in the gap between the two ends of the period spectrum that David's just given. So we have papers on the later medieval period, on the 16th, 17th century, the 17th century, and 18th century, 18th century, and 19th century, 4 papers, period papers like that. So the second year fills in that gap. And from that perspective, you've got a huge range of literary texts, literary periods, and literary approaches to draw on. And that's what can inform and really guide your choices for the third year, when what you do is much more sort of coursework directed. So there's a coursework portfolio on Shakespeare. You write 3 2,000-word essays for submission. There's a coursework which is faculty taught on all kinds of, you have a choice from all kinds of things, from kind of film criticism to children's literature to the essay to global literatures, all kinds of things. They're different every year with some core things. So people really tend to really enjoy that chance to specialize in what we call paper 6. And then finally, there's a dissertation. And for that, you can pick up anything from the all 3 years of the course, any period, any approach, any literature in English. So that's, what's great about that is you've actually got a huge range to choose from because of all the work you've done in the first, second years. And finally, I guess our exams now, the assessment of the English course is your overall classification is based on 7 marks. 4 of them are for closed book exams at the end of the 3rd year, and the other 3 are for coursework. So it's not quite 50-50, but there is quite a high percentage of coursework now in the English degree, and less of an emphasis on those final exams.
For English and modern languages, which is one of the joint schools that we teach in Hartford, things are slightly different. So for your first year, you would do 2 out of the 4 papers that you would normally have in English literature. So you would choose 2, and you would have 4 others in your modern language of choice. Finals, I think the system is that you would do 3 papers, 3 period papers in English language or literature, and you would also do the dissertation. So in all, you'd have 4 components of work on the English side for FHS, or for finals, as we call it. So I guess you might have another question about how we do things here, Saida. What do you think we should lead with next?
Well, I would say Oxford has a very different teaching style to some of the other universities, so it would be great if you could tell us a bit more about that and how it's structured.
Absolutely. Well, there's quite a mix, as you say. So first off, I suppose, if you were to pitch up in first year, you would have to go to lectures, and they are provided by the faculty as a whole. They tend to run in correlation with certain papers, although you're free to attend virtually any lecture that there is out there in Oxford. And so you should not find yourself too constrained by the particular text that you're studying at the period. And those lectures differ, I suppose, in what they're trying to do. Sometimes they're very, very introductory. Sometimes they are a circus, as we call them, where different lecturers appear on different themes under a general rubric. And then there are more specialized lectures where sometimes people are trying out ideas that they might be writing up into a book, and they're trying them out on a first audience of students. So you can get actually quite technical or specialized lectures as well. That's your main opportunity, of course, as well, to mingle and mix with students from other colleges, because they're available to students from all colleges to attend. The rest of the teaching tends to take place in college, and they involve a mix of classes and tutorials. Emma, would you like to say about what might differentiate a class from a tutorial?
Yeah, that's great. So in Hartford, and actually in most colleges, take perhaps between 6 and 12 students for English. In Hartford, we take about 8 or 9 in a year group. And when we have a class or a seminar, we would be teaching that group all together. And we would tend to use that to perhaps introduce topics, bring out more a range of different approaches or different kind of methodologies that you might want to bring to your work. We'd probably set some critical reading as well as some reading in the primary text for us all to discuss together. And the point, I guess, of the class or seminar is to hear different people's voices and to get different points of view, both of the people in the room and the people whose work has been set for reading. And then they would be usually alternated with tutorial style teaching. And for tutorials, we would have 2 or 3 students with a tutor, with David or me or one of our other colleagues. And the emphasis there, I think, is on how we can actually improve your work. The people who are there who've usually brought an essay or had an essay submitted, or a paper or some kind of written work in response to a reading list. And the point of the tutorial is to discuss and develop the ideas of those essays, to think about how they could have been more powerful, more rhetorically effective, how they might have brought in different kind of material. So it's very much based on you and the work that you've done. Now, there are really big advantages to that, we think. One of the best things about my job is I think we get to know our students well through that process. We get to know their strengths and their weaknesses as literary critics, and that's an enormous privilege. That's very, very different from working in a university where perhaps you have 30 or 40 students in a seminar group, and then they move on in the next term, and you don't really get to know them at all. So I think it is really, and people write a lot here. They do a lot of processing of their thought through writing, and I think that produces very rapid development and improvement in people's work. Of course, you can see that it is quite, it can be quite intensive. It's hard to duck away and not be present. There's not much of the Oxford course which is about just sort of turning up and sitting at the back of the lecture theatre and then leaving. It's not a very passive course. It's quite an active kind of learning experience. And that doesn't mean you have to be super confident or super cocky or like a debater or something. It's not that kind of thing, but it does mean that you need to feel that this would be a good system in which you could develop, and that you want to have the kind of focus on your work that would help you make it better.
Yeah. You know, on some basic level, you should enjoy talking about, be able to enjoy the opportunity of being able to talk about ideas and exchange ideas and to think on your feet, which is clearly what a tutorial is about in large part. Saida, could we ask you, what did you find to be, you know, some of the differences between how you were taught at school and how you've been taught at Oxford, and how has the tutorial system worked for you?
Yeah, I was just thinking while you were speaking that the benefit of the tutorials, as you say, you get to know your tutors really well as well, and they get to know you, and you have that much more personal approach to your work than you get at school, where the teacher might not have the time to give you personal feedback all the time, whereas in Oxford, you get that feedback every week for every essay that you write, and that is really great, especially if you love English. You really get to like develop as a critic and develop your voice and learn very quickly.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things that we're quite committed to is that it is your voice. We're not trying to make you into a mini me or a mini Emma. You know, we're really keen that it's Saida's voice that comes out, and I guess we place a big emphasis on that pluralism, I suppose, in the tutorial system. You know. I'm quite interested in literature and philosophy, but I'm not expecting necessarily that to come out in my students. You might be interested in a very different approach. Other tutors are very historicist, but they're very open to more formalistic approaches in the tutorials. So I guess the key thing about the tutorial is that you're shaping the learning experience. We're not imposing a model on you.
Yeah, so this is probably a question everyone wants to know is, what are you looking for in an applicant for English at Harvard?
I think there's one really simple answer to that, actually. We're looking for people who read a lot and think about what they read. And that seems so simple that I think people can't quite imagine that it's true. But one of the things our course really demands and really rewards is a wide appetite for reading and thinking across a whole range of periods and a range of genres. So if people can show that they're already doing that and they're already tussling a bit with that, it's not even quite so much reading what you love and loving everything that you read. I don't think that's probably not going to be possible across the course of studying English. It's not, and so it's about, you know, finding ways of analysing and thinking about texts that perhaps don't immediately speak to you or don't seem entirely relevant to your world, or need a bit of extra material to sort of support you in how you relate to them. So I think that appetite for reading, and that you can demonstrate that on the personal statement, that you're reading a little bit aside from the set texts that are part of your school or college course, that you're following up things that seem interesting, that you have access to more widely, that you've got a kind of independent appetite to do that reading and to think about it. I think that's a really major element of what we're looking for. What would you say, David?
It's worth absolutely. I think that's that sense of a willingness to read and to reflect critically on what you read are key. But we'd want to also stress that we're not looking for particular content here in what you might read. So it could be range from Harry Potter to Hunger Games. We want just to see a certain critical intelligence being used to talk about that reading. So don't feel like you necessarily have to tuck into War and Peace and get that under the belt in order to get into Oxford. It's more an intellectual responsiveness to what you read, and an enthusiasm for the act of reading that are really mean a lot to us.
Yeah, and often we'll ask. Sorry, David.
I remember Saida's when she came in, and I remember her interview with us. You were kind of nervous about talking about teen fiction and some of the things you were into. That was something that you were really interesting about, and said some wonderfully interesting things. And you were surprised that we were so interested in what you had to say about that, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, no, that was, I did talk a lot about young adult fiction, both in my personal statement and during the interview. And I just did not anticipate that was going to happen in an Oxford interview. So you should definitely talk about the things that you really enjoy reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was just going to say, just in addition to that, when you're thinking about, how you might talk about that reading, sometimes we are really interested in the how. How does this work? How does this writer convey? Not so much the what. So we don't necessarily want you to summarize the plot or what happens, but how a particular effect's created. That's one of the questions you can ask yourself. What are the techniques, what are the means by which this writer brings us close to characters, or creates suspense, or all those kinds of questions. So trying to think about how a work, whatever work it is, how it's put together and how it makes its effects, rather than what it's about, which is always tends to be a slightly less interesting sort of answer. I mean, the novels of Jane Austen and kind of Mills and Boon are about the same thing, but they're not the same kinds of writing, and that's the way to get at that.
We also noticed some candidates already begin with an interest, which we try and develop, I suppose, particularly with paper 1 in first year. They're interested in models of reading and in different and rival schools of how you might interpret a text. So they're already beginning to stand over their own reading practice and look at some of the assumptions that seem to be governing that. So if you could stand back from the way you read at times, or just be more attentive to the types of reading that the text itself kind of expects or dictates, that's really good too. And that's something that we really try and work on in your first year, but throughout the Oxford degree.
And we'll want to talk about that in the interview, if we just mention that briefly now. If you come, the important thing about the application process is to reiterate that we get lots of different kinds of evidence from different sources. We get the evidence of your prior school performance and your predicted grades, or your achieved grades if you've already got them. We get your school reference. We get the ELAT test, which, if you don't know about that, it's a test that you sit in your school or college. earlier on in the autumn, which is really about close reading of particular passages. You'll see an exam paper with 6 or 7 short passages, a mixture of poems and prose, usually all about the same theme, and you pick 2 or 3 of them to write about and to compare how they work. So you bring the skills that you've got from your study of English to these passages, which we don't expect you will have come across before, and we don't need you to have a broader context for. So we've got the ELAT ELAT test marks. Just to say, if you want to know more about the ELAT, you can look on the English faculty website, english.ox.ac.uk, and the admissions pages there have got previous examples of the ELAT. So we've got that information, we get a bit of schoolwork that you submit to us, and then we also have the interview. So it's really important to it's really important to make clear that the interview is not all the, it's not the everything. People can come in and do not such good interviews, but the rest of their application is so strong that's absolutely fine. And some people can come in and do great interviews, and that can compensate a bit, perhaps, for a less good performance elsewhere in the application sort of metrics. So if you come, so all that I'm saying about interviews is just because this is a thing people worry about, not because this is the single most important thing about the process. But if you come to Hertford for interviews in English, you'll have two interviews with each with 2 tutors. One will be going through a poem that you get shortly in advance of the interview, and that you read through yourself and think about, and that then we talk through in the interview. We talk through how it works and what you've noticed about it, and we do that really to see, how do you build on suggestions, how do you go back, how do you do sort of sustained reading, how do you go back to something and maybe see it in a different light because you get some new information. How detailed are you in the ways that you look at reading? And then there'll be a second interview, which is much more guided by you and your interests as you've put them out in your personal statement. So the titles of books or authors that have interested you, perhaps the things you're studying at school or college, that will form the kind of basis of that interview. And I guess our aim there is to think a little bit more widely, to test that appetite for wide reading, and to see how you maybe think about connections between works that you've read for different parts of the course, your course, or for different purposes, and sort of think a little bit more widely. And yeah, so that's what we're aiming to do there. There won't be anything weird in an English interview, because we already know what the subject is. You're already doing it. There are different ways that English works at university from the way it works at school or college, but it's essentially, recognizably the same subject. So we're not asking those kind of wacky questions that you sometimes read about, or asking you to do wacky things or be surprising or original or something. In fact, it's quite predictable what we're going to ask you about. Are you good and careful and sustained at reading? And do you like to read and reflect a lot on your reading? They're the obvious things that we want to talk about.
Yeah, we're not going to be asking you to just explain the color blue or riff on the color blue.
No, exactly. And we won't ask you about the rest of the things on your personal statement. It's not that we're not interested, but it's not relevant to us whether you do, I don't know, Duke of Edinburgh or debating or something. It's not really, it's not part of the criteria that we would use to try and select our students.
And just bear that in mind, that in interviews and throughout the assessment process at admissions, we're really trying to look for potential. We're not expecting you to pitch up as a finished product. It would be pretty kind of make our role fairly redundant if you did. So the key thing to bear in mind is that responsiveness within an interview is quite important. We'll be looking out for how well you're able to readjust your position in the light of a different view or more evidence. We're not expecting you to come present a very fixed case and for that case to be definitive, either in the first or the second interview. So that flexibility means a lot to us. And it's underpins one key aspect of the assessment, which is how teachable are you, and will you enjoy a tutorial process where both of you are at times thinking on your feet.
We're probably coming up to the end, aren't we? Is there anything, Saida, you want to add? Is there anything you wish you had known when you were at this point?
I guess one thing that I realized during the first year and now second year is that the other subjects that you do at A level might actually help you a lot. So there's a bit of philosophy and a bit of history involved in the English degree, and doing those subjects at A levels was a huge benefit to to my understanding of the literature. So just because your other subjects also do matters and they might come in handy later on. So that was one thing that I realized. Yeah.
That's really useful. And I'm just wondering, could you tell us what aspect of the Oxford degree have you enjoyed the most, or is there one that you can pick out? Is that too reductive?
I don't think I could pinpoint one specific thing, but I think what I love about the English degree at Oxford is the fact that, as you said, it's very historical based and you get to do so many different periods. So I came across texts that are both canonical, but also texts that I would have never come across by myself, and certainly not texts that I would have come across at school. So doing Old English in first year, although a bit terrifying at first, was actually one of the most fun parts of my first year course that I did, and it was just really great to do something new and different. So yeah, I just like to pick out things that I enjoy in every single paper that you do. So yeah.
Good.
This is we're all adapting, aren't we, to doing things a bit differently, and one of the things that means for this session is we can't take your questions. There's a lot of information around online, both on the Hertford website and on the English faculty website, but if you feel that your questions aren't answered, do get in touch with our admissions office and they will send on queries to us, and we'll be able to answer those. And I guess, what we would want to say is, I think we all really enjoy Hertford English. We enjoy the kind of camaraderie. I think we have good relationships between tutors and students, a good range of people working and teaching for us. We enjoy things like our English dinner, our get-together. We enjoy other kinds of things that aren't directly related to the course, and we would really like to have your application to us.